Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Well, today we're looking at some pretty powerful ideas from Francis Schaeffer.
Oh, Schaeffer. Great pick.
Yeah, he really gets you thinking. He tackles some really heavy philosophical questions, but he does it in such a way that you'll find, I think, surprisingly easy to grasp and, even fun to think about.
I like that.
Yeah, so we're going to focus on some key differences between historic Christianity and what Schaeffer calls the new theology.
Okay, so that's like the main theme.
Exactly. And we'll be looking particularly at how these two views differ when it comes to the nature of personality, how we can even know anything is true.
Big questions.
Big questions. And of course, how each of these worldviews tries to explain the problem of evil in the world. That age-old question, if God is good, why is there so much suffering?
It's a tough one.
Yeah, it is.
You know what I think is fascinating about Schaeffer's approach? Is that he starts with something we all experience, our own personalities.
Right.
He uses this thought experiment. Imagine you see a lake high up in the Alps, and it's sitting at a level higher than another lake nearby. Where did that water come from?
Interesting question.
Right. It couldn't have come from the lower lake. There has to be another source.
Yeah, it has to come from somewhere higher up. I see where he's going with this.
It's like he's saying our personalities, with all our thoughts, feelings, and creativity, they can't just appear out of thin air.
Out of nothing.
Schaeffer argues that personality has to come from a source that is itself personal.
So if we follow that line of thinking...
It leads us to two options, really.
Okay, lay 'em on me.
Either our personalities come from a personal God, or they're just an illusion, a byproduct of impersonal forces. And if it's the latter...
Then what?
Well, then everything we think, feel, and aspire to is ultimately meaningless.
No, that's a bit unsettling, right? I mean, to think that everything we are is just
a cosmic accident.
Yeah. It's like Schaeffer's analogy of the fish with lungs. If we're just products of a meaningless universe, then all our hopes and dreams for purpose and meaning are kind of like those lungs.
Totally out of place.
And, I can see how that analogy might resonate with someone who feels like something is missing in their life.
Like they don't quite fit in.
Yeah, but they can't quite figure out what it is.
Right, exactly. It's this feeling of...
like a square peg in a round hole.
Yeah. A sense of nihilism, I guess.
I think that's a great way to put it. And, Schaeffer was really pushing back against thinkers like Julian Huxley, who said we should just act as if God exists, even if we don't believe in him.
As if, huh?
Yeah. But Schaeffer saw, I think, a deep flaw in that kind of thinking.
What was it?
Well, it requires us to live a lie, even if we think it's a helpful one.
I mean, I can see how that would be.
Kind of hard to sustain, right?
Yeah, in the long run. I mean, if you're constantly pretending, eventually.
Yeah, you start to question everything.
Exactly. So if we accept Schaeffer's idea, that personality comes from a personal God.
Okay, let's say we do. Then what? What does that mean for how we understand truth? Can we actually know anything for sure?
That's where things get really interesting. Schaeffer argues that if we start with a personal God who creates beings capable of language, it's perfectly logical to think that God would communicate with us.
It makes sense. If we can talk and he made us, he can probably talk too.
Right. And he did. Schaeffer points to the Bible as God's communication to humanity.
Okay.
But it's not just any kind of communication. Schaeffer calls it propositional revelation.
Ooh, fancy term. I'm intrigued.
It means that God communicates specific, verifiable truths in the Bible, not just vague feelings or mystical experiences.
So it's like God is speaking to us in clear sentences.
Yeah, not just in poetic whispers. And because God is the source of all truth, we can be confident that what he reveals in the Bible is actually true. Schaeffer sees this as the foundation for a unified understanding of knowledge.
Does that mean there's no room for scientific exploration then?
Good question.
If God has already told us everything we need to know in the Bible, why bother with science?
That's a great point. But Schaeffer isn't saying that God has revealed everything exhaustively. There's still plenty to discover about the world through science.
Okay, so how do we know what's what?
Think of it like a conversation.
Okay.
You can tell someone the truth about something without revealing every single detail.
I see. So science can help us understand the details of how God created the world.
Right.
Even if the Bible doesn't give us all the specifics.
Precisely. The problem, as Schaeffer saw it, was that this new theology was separating religious truth from history and the cosmos, making it impossible to actually verify any truth claims.
So if religious truth is just subjective and has nothing to do with the real world, then...
It becomes meaningless.
Meaningless. I see. So for Schaeffer, the Christian worldview offers a solid foundation for understanding both the spiritual and the physical world.
He saw them as interconnected.
But what about the problem of evil? How does he address the very real suffering and cruelty we see in the world?
It's a question that has, haunted humanity for centuries.
Yeah.
And Schaeffer certainly doesn't offer any easy answers.
Right.
But he does provide, I think, a helpful framework for understanding how the Christian worldview approaches this dilemma.
Lay it on me.
One thing Schaeffer points out is that the word love itself, it becomes problematic in a world without a personal God.
How so?
Well, if love is just a chemical reaction or a social construct, it loses its inherent value and permanence.
Yeah, if there's no ultimate source for love, then it's just a
fleeting feeling.
Here today, gone tomorrow.
Exactly. But Schaeffer grounds the meaning of love in the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He shows how love existed within the Godhead before anything else was created.
Before the universe, even.
And that love overflows into God's love for us, our love for Him, and our love for each other.
So love then isn't just some arbitrary emotion. It's rooted in the very nature of God Himself.
Precisely. And that has huge implications for how we understand the problem of evil. Schaeffer contrasts this historic Christian view with what he called the new theology.
Right. What was their take again on why there's so much bad stuff happening?
They were basically saying that man has always been fallen, that evil is just part of our nature.
Inherently bad.
Schaeffer uses this chilling quote from Baudelaire, the poet, to illustrate this. If there is a God, he is the devil.
Wow. That's pretty intense.
It is. It gets to the heart of the problem. If humanity has always been inherently flawed, if evil is just part of who we are, then how could God be anything but evil himself?
It's like a self-defeating argument almost.
It is, and it leads to a sense of moral meaninglessness. Schaeffer tells this story about a Hindu student who was really wrestling with this.
Oh, interesting. What happened?
When confronted with the idea that, cruelty and kindness are ultimately equal, the student was horrified.
Yeah, I can see why.
He realized that in a world without a personal God, there's no real basis for morality.
So how does the Christian worldview offer a different perspective?
Schaeffer argues that evil entered the world through a specific moral choice, a fall from the state of original innocence.
A fall from grace, so to speak.
This means that evil is not part of God's original design. It's a distortion of that design.
Okay, that explains how evil got into the world. But it still doesn't answer the question of why a loving God would allow suffering to continue.
You're right. And Schaeffer doesn't pretend to have all the answers. He acknowledges the mystery of suffering. But he does offer some insights from the Christian worldview. For example, he points to the cross of Christ as the ultimate example of God's love and his willingness to enter into our suffering.
That makes me think of Schaeffer's analysis of Camus' book, The Plague. Camus presents this false dilemma. Either you fight the plague and therefore fight God, or you side with God and are inhuman.
Right.
But Schaeffer says that's a misrepresentation of the Christian position. The real scandal of the cross isn't about blindly believing in God's goodness despite evil.
Right.
It's about the world rejecting God despite his love for us.
Exactly. And this gets to the heart of the difference between these two worldviews. The new theology, in Schaeffer's view, ultimately sees man as inherently flawed, while historic Christianity sees man as created in God's image, capable of both great good and great evil.
Capable of both. So there's this tension, right, between our potential for good and our capacity for evil.
That makes a big difference in how we understand things like sin, guilt, forgiveness, and even the possibility of redemption.
Huge implications. But Schaeffer doesn't just leave us with a theoretical framework, does he? He also wants to know how we can be sure that Christianity is actually true.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. He's made a compelling case.
Yes.
But how do we move from intellectual assent to actual belief?
Schaeffer uses a powerful analogy to illustrate this process. He asks us to imagine a book where most of the pages have been ripped out, leaving just a few scraps on each page.
Okay, I'm picturing it. What do those scraps represent?
The scraps are like the observable world, the things we can see and experience through our senses and reason. The missing pages represent God's special revelation in the Bible.
I see. So it's like we're trying to piece together the story of reality with only fragments of information.
Precisely. Schaeffer argues that we can use reason to see how those scraps fit together. And when we do, we find that the Christian worldview makes more sense of the world than any other explanation.
So we're looking for those missing pages that complete the story. But how do we know if the Bible is the right set of missing pages? How do we know it's the right book?
Schaeffer says there are 2 steps to establishing proof. First, the theory has to be non-contradictory. In other words, it can't contain logical inconsistencies.
So it needs to be internally consistent, right?
And second, we have to be able to live consistently with that theory.
If a worldview can't be lived out in the real world, then,
It's probably not a very good worldview.
right, it's got to work in practice, not just in theory.
Exactly. And Schaeffer argues that the Christian worldview passes both of these tests. It offers a coherent and consistent explanation of reality. And it provides a framework for living a meaningful and purposeful life.
So it's not just about believing the right things, it's about living in a way that aligns with those beliefs.
Right. And that's where Schaeffer's emphasis on the whole person comes in. He acknowledges the importance of rationality, but he also recognizes that we're more than just thinking machines.
We're emotional beings, we're relational beings.
We're spiritual beings.
And Schaeffer believes that true knowledge involves engaging with truth on all these levels.
That's precisely what Schaeffer's getting at. He tells a story about a black pastor who, after a rather intellectual discussion of these ideas, simply said, "Now I can worship God better."
Wow, that's beautiful. It shows how true knowledge should lead us to a deeper, richer experience of God.
And a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us. Remember Schaeffer's analogy of the artist using form to communicate. He argued that we need rationality, like an artist needs form, to make sense of the world. But too much form can stifle creativity and expression.
So we need a balance between reason and experience, between thinking and feeling.
Exactly. He saw it as an attempt to blend Christianity with existentialism
Oh, okay.
and relativism.
And he felt that those philosophies were just fundamentally
Incompatible.
with the core truths of the Christian faith.
Right. If there's no objective truth,
Then everything becomes just a matter of
personal opinion.
and morality
Of the
loses
Christian
its
faith.
foundation.
Exactly. That's what worried him. He saw this trend as a threat
Not just to the church.
to society as a whole.
But even though Schaeffer was a strong defender of the Christian worldview, he wasn't exactly known for being a fire and brimstone preacher.
Oh, no, not at all.
He was known for his,
Gentleness, humility,
and his willingness to engage
practical dialogue.
with people who held different views.
Yeah, he believed in meeting people where they were.
I admire that about him.
It's a good model for us all.
He wasn't afraid of honest debate.
And that's such a valuable lesson for us today.
In a world that's often so divided and polarized,
We need to be able to engage in civil discourse,
to listen to opposing viewpoints.
seek common ground.
It's not about, shouting down those who disagree with us.
Yeah.
It's about engaging them in a thoughtful and respectful way.
Schaeffer believed that true dialogue requires both conviction and compassion.
Conviction and compassion. It seems like Schaeffer was also really concerned about the practical outworking of the Christian faith.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about, head knowledge.
Right.
It's about living out our faith
In tangible ways,
throughout the week.
Schaeffer challenged Christians to be salt and light,
Agents of change
make a real difference.
in their communities.
It sounds a lot like what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount.
He was deeply rooted in the teachings of Jesus.
So how do Schaeffer's ideas apply to the challenges we face today in the 21st century?
I think his work offers a timeless challenge to us.
To think deeply about our faith,
Engage with the culture around us.
to live out the gospel in practical ways,
He was calling us to be both thoughtful and active.
rooted in truth, but also engaged in the world.
Precisely. He reminds us that the Christian worldview,
It's not just a set of beliefs.
it's a way of life,
It's a way of seeing the world.
a way of understanding ourselves and how we relate to others,
And it's a worldview, wouldn't you say, that has the power
to transform individuals.
communities and even nations.
Schaeffer believed the stakes were high. We're not just debating ideas
It's a spiritual battle.
for the hearts and minds of people.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Schaeffer's work, I want to leave you with this question. If Schaeffer's right about the nature of personality, the possibility of knowledge, and the reality of man's dilemma, how should that impact the way you live your life in the world today?
That's a question worth pondering.
It is.
And it has the potential to shape everything you do, everything you become.
Keep exploring these ideas
Wrestle with these questions.
and keep seeking truth.
The world needs people who are willing to think deeply, love boldly, and make a difference for eternity.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the thought of Francis Schaeffer.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope it's challenged and inspired you to consider how the Christian worldview can provide a solid foundation for understanding yourself, the world around you, and your place in it.
Until next time.
Keep seeking truth, keep growing in grace, and keep making a difference in the world around you.